Welcome back to the second episode of The Next Shift, and I'm going to be keeping with the same topics I covered in the first episode about youth unemployment, but we're going to be taking a bit of a step back. I'm not going to be concentrating over the last year. If you want to focus in on those ideas, then just take a look at that video. I'm not going to focus in on the last 18 years of perilous politicking, which included the financial crash and Brexit and so on and so forth, but I'm going to go back 100 years. But before we get there, obviously, there's a youth unemployment epidemic happening at the moment. That's what I've coined it in the last video, because there are over 1 million people aged between 16 and 24 within the UK who are classified as NEET, which stands for Not in Education, Employment or Training. But the story of young people struggling to find work is not a new one whatsoever, and the reasons for it happening over and over again are not that complicated. It's more of a case that they're consistently ignored through stubborn governance. So let's go back 100 years, back to the 1920s, just after the First World War, where hundreds of thousands of British young men were returning from the front with little to no formal qualifications, limited transferable skills, and a country that had been economically hollowed out by 4 years of industrial war efforts. Unemployment remained remarkably high throughout the 1920s, averaging well over 10% for the entire decade. And for young people who were obviously the least established in their workforce, the impact was disproportionately severe. The highest recorded overall unemployment rate during this era hit 23.4% in May 1921. Youth unemployment concentrated in the poorest of industrial towns, which was considerably worse. And what's interesting about this period is what the government's response looked like, because it looked like they didn't give much of a bother. And there was a massive assumption during this period, and very similar to the assumptions which are happening by the government right now, that the market would eventually just course correct on its own, and that the market would eventually absorb young workers if they're willing to be patient enough and cheap enough being the important thing there. We've never really grown out of that ideology. There were no career services, there was no structured guidance. You left school, you found a trade, or you didn't. And then the Great Depression of the 1930s just exacerbated everything. The unemployment rate climbed to over 20%, where it remained for all of 1931 and 1932. Young people who had no savings, no tenure, no protection were the first to go and the last to be rehired, which might sound familiar. And then unfortunately, another world war hits and more young people are lost to this industrial complex. More young people come out of that with less qualifications than they had before, than the generation that came through before them. But there was a post-war 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s boom period, and for a brief moment things actually worked. The 1950s and 60s in particular represented one of the longest prolonged periods of full employment in British history, and that was helped by global post-war economic booms and a genuine political commitment to keeping people in work. The lowest recorded unemployment rate in that period was just 1% in the mid-1950s. 1%. Let that sit with you for a moment, given we're standing here in 2026 with youth unemployment alone being at 16%. But here's the thing with any employment-based booms, and in particular the 2022 to 2024 period post-pandemic, there was a real employment boom which happened then, which similarly to this masked the structural problems that were happening underneath. Because after 2 decades of real rejoicing happening in the youth unemployment market, or the youth employment market, the 1970s then arrived with stagflation, industrial collapse, and the beginning of the end for the kind of manufacturing economy that had given young working class people a clear and well-paid pathway. The mines, the factories, the shipyards, these weren't just employers, they were pipelines for people. You left school at 16, you went in, you learned a trade, and someone who knew what they were doing would show you how to do what comes next. Not perfect, not glamorous, but it was structured. And unfortunately, when those industries collapsed, so did the pipelines alongside them, and nobody really built new ones. So by the 1980s, or the early 1980s, unemployment soared. The official level exceeded 3 million people by 1982, hitting the rate of 11.9% of unemployment in 1984, which was a post-war record. For young people, it was even bleaker. The government's response was a series of training schemes. The youth training scheme, enterprise allowances. These were all widely criticised at the time, though, as they were parking young people in something that looked like an activity without actually concerning them with real employment. Critics at the time called it warehousing. Young people were being kept busy than being prepared. So there's very obviously a pattern emerging here, and you can probably see it, that there's a boom period of 10, 15, 20 years, followed by a bust period of 10, 15, 20 years. There's the 20s and 30s, followed by the 40s and 50s. There are the 70s and 80s, followed by the 90s and early 2000s. Youth unemployment rates peaked once again following the 2008 financial crash, reaching 22.5% in 2011. That's over 1 in 5 young people in this country who are out of work. However, this is where the pattern kind of gets broken a little bit, because we never really reached normality once again. There were the 5 years post the financial crash where austerity measures were brought in. So for the large scale of the working class, they were struggling a little bit further. Unemployment rates did get better, but there were the introduction of things like 0-hour contracts, which were really muddying the waters as to what unemployment actually looked like. And there was some really interesting CIPD research regarding graduates during this period, and I still think it goes underappreciated. And of those who graduated in 2022 in particular, only 61% of university graduates were able to gain full-time employment within 15 months of graduating. After 3 or 4 years of education and tens of thousands of pounds of debt, those people are still struggling to find entry-level jobs right now. And now, wherever you're watching this from in 2026, it is happening once again, because there are over 735,000 young people who are currently unemployed. A youth unemployment rate of 16.2%, which is up from 14.3% in the previous year. The number of young people who are NEET has exceeded 1 million people for the first time since 2013. And crucially, the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that the fall in youth employment between 2022 and 2025 is approaching the scale of decline we saw during the 2008 financial crisis. However, we don't have a singular point of failure to point this towards. We don't have the 2008 financial crash. We have lots of external financial catastrophes happening everywhere. The last part of this should really concern you, because every other time that this has happened, the 1930s, the 1980s, the 2008 financial crash, there's been an obvious external catastrophe to point it at, one singular point of failure. Whereas right now, everything is structural, and the government's own review has noted that the NEET rate has only fallen below 10% once in the last 25 years. That's not in boom or bust, not before the pandemic or after the pandemic. Britain's problem with youth unemployment is not cyclical, it's chronic now. It's getting worse. Now, to understand why, I want to introduce you to 3 structural problems that have sat at the center of each one of these crises that have never properly been addressed. The first one, which I'd like to coin the transition gap, I'm going to explain to you. The moment between finishing education and entering work is the most dangerous person in a young person's professional life, not because the job market is uniquely hostile to them, although sometimes it obviously is, but because nobody teaches you how to navigate it. There is obviously no standard module in a GCSE, an A-level, or a degree that teaches you how employment actually works, how to read a job description, how to understand what an employer is really asking for when they want somebody with excellent communication skills, how to negotiate a salary, how to ask for feedback after a rejection, how to fail at an interview and use it constructively. And without sounding preachy, and this is not meant to be preachy, you kind of spend 13 years being assessed on your ability to sit in a room and recall information under pressure. And then you are released into a market that wants to know what you can actually do. And nobody's ever really asked you that question properly before. And the mismatch is getting bigger, not smaller. Graduate hiring has fallen 8% year on year, while the number of applications per vacancy has tripled since 2002, from 38 applications per graduate vacancy to over 140. More than 1.2 million applications were submitted for just under 17,000 graduate vacancies in 2023. That is not a job market, that is a lottery. And nobody is teaching young people how to play it. The second issue here that I want to focus on is specifically aimed at higher education, and it's called the advice vacuum. Universities are obviously world-class at getting you a foot in the door. The marketing infrastructure behind British universities is immense. That's why people from around the world come to complete their academia in the UK. The careers infrastructure, unfortunately, is mostly an afterthought. And there's a stat that I find genuinely staggering from the ONS, and that's that almost half of university graduates in the UK, around 47% or so, are working in non-graduate roles. That's jobs such as sales assistants or care workers. And that figure is up from 38% during the financial crash. Nearly half of those people who went through the entire university system are doing jobs that didn't require any form of degree. And it's not because they chose to necessarily. In most cases, it's because they came out the other side without the skills to compete for the roles that they were supposed to justify the investment. And so if I play a little bit more generically here and just focus in on big four accountancy firms, who are firms that historically hire more graduates than pretty much anyone else, they are all reducing their graduate cohort. KPMG are reducing their cohort by 29% in a single year, their graduate cohort. Deloitte are reducing theirs by 18%, Ernst & Young by 11%, PwC by 6%. And these are not just small adjustments. These are employers that were supposed to absorb the best skilled, best qualified people out of university, and they are systematically pulling back. And yet, some 150,000 UK academics have left higher education since 2014, while the number of students has increased by more than 400,000. Student staff ratios at some institutions have doubled. You are paying more for less contact time with less support in a market that is becoming harder to enter. And the institution is taking your money during this and has, in many cases, almost no idea what is happening outside of its own walls. And the third major structural problem I think that is happening right now with the youth is that there is a massive exposure gap. In almost every decade in the last 100 years, the young people who navigated the transition most successfully from education to the working world were those who had existing connections to the world of work. Not necessarily the most academically gifted, not the ones with the best CVs, the ones who knew someone. Unfortunately, that is always going to be the case, but also the ones whose parents worked in a particular industry, the ones whose school had a relationship with local employers. And the data on apprenticeships really tells the revealing story here. 93% of people, young people in particular, who complete their apprenticeship sustain long-term employment afterwards. That's 93% of people. And if we compare that to the graduate market, where, as we just covered, 47% of people end up in a job that didn't require a degree whatsoever. Apprenticeship starting salaries have also increased by 51% since 2018. The average university graduate, on the other hand, leaves with approximately £45,000 worth of student debt and enters a job market where over 140 people are competing for every single vacancy. So why is this? Well, it's because apprenticeships go some way to solving the exposure gap. They put young people into the room. They create the structured relationship between education and the workplace that those manufacturing pipelines back in the 60s, say, for example, used to provide, and that the university sector has largely failed to replicate. And so this is where I want to finish up with this all being a history lesson, because we're in a moment right now where all three of these structural problems are colliding simultaneously with an economic environment that is already very hostile to young workers. We covered the Employment Rights Act with the hiring slowdown in the last video. If you haven't watched that, go watch it, because what we're describing today is the soil, and what we covered last time is the weather. The pattern I want you to take from this, and over the last 100 years, is not necessarily a depressing one, or at least it doesn't have to be. It's more that every generation that came through a period of youth unemployment, the 1930s, the 1980s, the 2010s, produced cohorts of people who built careers despite the conditions, not because of them. They weren't waiting to be chosen. They were the people who often, without formal support or institutional guidance, figured out how to get themselves into a room. However, to give us a semblance of hope and kind of a takeaway for any young people who are potentially watching this video, the major difference I've encountered throughout covering this brief history, no matter what the era or decade, is that right now, the opportunity to be in the room without formal invitation has never been lower. And what I mean by that is that the barriers to demonstrating what you can do without a degree, without a connection, and without an employer who has to take a financial risk on you has never been lower. The ability to learn in public, to show your work, to find people in an industry who are talking honestly about what they do and ask them an intelligent question, that hasn't really existed before, and institutions are just catching up with that. The structural problems are very obviously there. The transition gap is still there. The advice vacuum will still be there. The exposure gap will probably always be there. But the workarounds are better than they've ever been. And understanding the history of how we got here is potentially the step to not repeating it. This has been The Next Shift, and I hope to see you next time.